So now that we have our first entity, what we're going to use is Entity Framework to scaffold our database. And in order to do this, we're going to need to use a DbContext class. And what we're going to do is going to create a new file or a new class inside our persistence project. And what we'll do is we'll just rename class1.cs to DataContext.cs. So we'll have a class called DataContext, and I also need to update this to DataContext as well. And what we want to do here is derive from an entity framework class called DbContext. But because we're in our persistence project, we actually don't have access to this at the moment. And what we need to do is we need to add entity framework into this particular project. So what we can do is we can open up our command shell, and what we'll make use of is the NuGet package manager we added as an extension to go ahead and install this. So I'm just going to say NuGet package manager add package, and what we need here is Microsoft.entityFramework core. And if I press return, this should give me a list of options related to Microsoft Entity Framework core. We need two of the packages from here. We need both Entity Framework core and Entity Framework core SQLite. And importantly, both of these need to be exactly the same version. So I'm going to select Entity Framework core, and the version that we want is in the 2.2 branch. Because our runtime is running on .NET Core 2.2, we also need to select a version compatible with that. So I'm just going to pick the latest version in the 2.2 branch, and we need to add this to our persistence project. So I'm just going to select that. And it will give us an option to restore so that these packages are installed and available inside the persistence project. So I'm just going to click restore, and this will go ahead and make this available. But as I mentioned, we also need the SQLite version of this. So I'm just going to repeat this. I'm going to say NuGet package manager add package, and then I'm going to say Microsoft.entityFramework core, and press return, and this time I'm going to go for the Microsoft Entity Framework core SQLite. And once again, we need to select the same version that we did for Entity Framework core. Otherwise, we're going to run into version compatibility problems. So I'm going to select 2.2.4. Once again, add it to the persistence project, and once again, click on the restore to make this package available. Now, with this in place, what we should be able to do is use the quick fix command, and we can either use the light bulb over here and specify that we're using Microsoft Entity Framework core, or we can press the command and period when we've got our cursor over the DbContext and just bring in using Entity Framework core. And now this is imported. If we look at the description of this, a DbContext instance represents a session with the database and can be used to query and save instances of our entities. So this is what we need to be able to query our database, and it's got a few other tricks up its sleeve as well. And one of them is to make use of entity framework migrations, which kind of gives us the ability to script a new database based on the entities that we create and specify inside this particular class. So what we need to do is we need to give this particular file a constructor. So I'm just going to type in CTOR and call it DataContext as the name of the constructor. And this takes some parameters, or a parameter, and we need to pass it some DbContext options and call it options. And we also need to use the options from the base class. So in order to do this, we'll specify base and options as well. And if you miss this off, then this will cause problems creating the migration. Now below the constructor, we don't need to actually add anything inside the constructor itself, but below the constructor, what we need to pass this is dbSet properties, or properties of type dbSet. And then we specify the entity that we want to use. Now in this case, we've only got one entity, it's called value. And in order to access this, we need to bring in domain because that's where our entities are located. So I'll say using domain. And what we do is we give this a name, and it's going to be called values. Now this values property is what's going to be used for the table name inside SQLite. And we'll see that when we actually go ahead and create our database. So with this in place, what we need to do is we need to add this as a service because we're going to be using this DbContext class, and we're going to inject it into various parts of our application so that we can query these entities in our database. And to do this, we'll need to go to our startup class. So I'm just going to go to the API, to the startup class, and we can add this as a service inside here. So what I'm going to do is go up to the services, and inside our dependency injection container, what I'm going to do is specify services, then add DbContext, and we need to tell it what our data context is. So I'll specify data context inside here, and what we need to do is bring in our persistence project inside our startup file. So I'll say using persistence, and this takes some options because we need to tell it what our database provider is, and in this case it's going to be SQLite. So I'm going to specify options and say opt, and then in this expression what I'm going to do is say opt use SQLite, and we should be able to bring this in from using Microsoft Entity Framework Core, and we have access to this because we used Microsoft Entity Framework Core SQLite earlier on. And then we need to pass this some configuration. Now what we need to do here is give it a connection string so that it's able to make a connection to our database. Now we don't have a connection string yet or a database, but what we can do is we can access our configuration because we have access to this inside our startup class, and I can say configuration get connection string, and I'm just going to specify default connection, and just close off the method with some semicolons. So this getConnectionString method is shorthand for getSection connection strings. And what we can do is we can define our connection string inside one of our configuration files. Now the file that I'm going to use to do this is the appsettings.json. So just open this particular file, and then what we'll do is we'll specify connection strings, and we'll open up this inside curly braces, and inside here I'll specify default connection, and in here we provide a SQLite connection string. Now SQLite connection strings are super simple, and that's part of the reason for using SQLite for development. It just makes it very easy to get up and running with a database without needing to install a database server. So we say the data source is equal to, and then I'm just going to give it a name of a file and say it's equal to reactivities.db. And this is all we need to provide for a SQLite connection string. So with this in place, we can actually go ahead and create an entity framework migration so that we can scaffold out what our database is going to look like. And we'll take a look at that next.